disinformation narratives recklessly defending the Turkestan Islamic Party by certain individuals within the East Turkestani diaspora. Critical thinking, not blindly following. We note with concern the dissemination of dangerous disinformation propaganda by certain individuals within the East Turkestani diaspora. These disinformation narratives recklessly defend the Turkestan Islamic Party, falsely portraying it as, quote, the armed force of the East Turkestani people, end quote, thereby undermining the legitimate cause of East Turkestan's national independence. The Turkestan Islamic Party, which emerged with the rebranding of the Uzbekistan Islamic Movement as the Turkestan Islamic Party weeks before the creation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by China in 2001, is identified by international governments and researchers as an Islamist organization with established links to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other entities that stand in direct opposition to our national independence struggle. Since its inception, the Turkestan Islamic Party has only served China by manipulating and sabotaging the East Turkestan national independence movement, serving solely as propaganda to misrepresent our national independence movement as an Islamist movement and falsely branding Uyghurs as so-called terrorists. To this day, the Turkestan Islamic Party's activities have exclusively benefited the interests of China, offering no benefit whatsoever to the East Turkestani people. We urge the East Turkestani people to exercise vigilance and critical thinking. The emergence of the Turkestan Islamic Party, its survival within the territories of China's strategic allies such as Pakistan and the Taliban, its activities against Western nations critical of China, as well as its presence in Syria under Turkey's oversight, despite Turkey having deep intelligence and security cooperation with China, should not only raise significant questions, but also make it clear as to whose interests they are truly fighting for. These facts contradict the recent deceptive propaganda by the Turkestan Islamic Party that they are fighting for East Turkestan's interests. Furthermore, misconceptions surrounding the delisting of the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Movement by the United States government have been exploited to falsely assert a non-existent endorsement of the Turkestan Islamic Party. It is imperative to clarify that the label East Turkestan Islamic Movement was a construct of Beijing manufactured on November 29, 2001, 2 months after the September 11 terror attacks, aimed at delegitimizing the broader East Turkestan independence movement, which unfortunately shares the same English-language acronym. Since then, China has been using the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Movement label to falsely portray all East Turkestani organizations and entities advocating for East Turkestan's independence as being East Turkestan Islamic Movement in an attempt to demonize our national independence struggle and discredit us in front of the international community. In response to the exposure of nearly 500 concentration camps across East Turkestan in November 2019 by the East Turkestan National Movement and the East Turkestan government in exile, the Chinese Foreign Ministry sought to discredit not only our findings but also our entities by deliberately and falsely labeling us as the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Movement. We reiterated our calls to the United States government, including then-Secretary Mike Pompeo, to delist the non-existent East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which China has been using to demonize and discredit our national independence struggle, from its terrorist exclusion list, given that such an entity does not exist, and China exploits such designation to demonize and discredit East Turkestan's legitimate national independence struggle. The removal of the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Movement from the United States terrorist exclusion list in October 2020 followed persistent advocacy by the East Turkestan National Movement and the East Turkestan government in exile, highlighting the absence of credible evidence for the existence of such a group. This decision underscores the distinction between the non-existent East Turkestan Islamic Movement and the legitimate aspirations of the East Turkestani people for independence. Yet, the removal of the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Movement by the US State Department is again being exploited by certain actors to mislead our people and falsely assert a non-existent endorsement of the Turkestan Islamic Party. The United States State Department, in its 2020 country report on terrorism, has explicitly stated the lack of credible evidence of the group's existence for over a decade, leading to its removal from the terrorist exclusion list. However, it also stated that Beijing inaccurately labeled the Turkestan Islamic Party as East Turkestan Islamic Movement. Turkestan Islamic Party is a violent extremist group active in Syria and Afghanistan that shares some characteristics with the China's description of East Turkestan Islamic Movement. Additionally, in response to inquiries by Newsweek in September 2021, a State Department spokesperson stated that, quote, Uyghur terrorists fighting in Syria and Afghanistan are members of the Turkestan Islamic Party, a separate organization that China and others have incorrectly identified as East Turkestan Islamic Movement, and that the Turkestan Islamic Party is an organization allied with the Taliban in Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda elements operating in Syria, end quote. It is essential to recognize that while many of the average fighters within the Turkestan Islamic Party's ranks may be truly committed to fighting for East Turkestan, the Turkestan Islamic Party's leadership, since its inception, is undoubtedly controlled by Chinese intelligence and its security partners like Turkey. We again call on the East Turkestani people to be vigilant and exercise critical thinking in order to avoid falling into the deceptive traps laid by Chinese intelligence and its security partners.
This article was written by Mr. Salih Hudayar, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Security of East Turkestan Government in exile.